It happened at 6:13 a.m. on a rain-frosted Wednesday, a day that was supposed to be ordinary. No jubilees, no scandals, no ceremonies. Yet that morning, as red security folders were carried across the walnut-paneled corridor of Kensington Palace, something had already shifted. The monarchy survives crises. That's the brand. That's the myth. But families have breaking points that dynasties can't spin, no matter how practiced their PR apparatus becomes. Let me take you back into the nerve center of a story that has been theorized, hinted at, fiercely debated, but never truly reconstructed in full form. Today, we build the foundation for a one-hour deep dive, the emotional seismic event, the mechanics of power, and the moment that forced an heir to speak the unspeakable. Have you ever watched a headline like it was a season finale? That's exactly how the world watched Sussex news. Addictive, polarizing, emotional. But ratings don't reveal motives, and motives are always the real throne that matters. What if I told you the phrase, "we disown you," wasn't the punchline? It was the pivot point. It was the Rubicon crossed. And everything before it was foreshadowing for something much worse than the public narrative ever captured. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now, why are we here? Because to write 28,000 to 30,000 words of a one-hour script, the intro itself must be engineered like a contract. Binding, emotional, unavoidable. This isn't just about a royal announcement. It's about stakes, global optics, inherited duty, personal resentment, and one underestimated Hollywood meets Windsor miscalculation. Let's ground the universe. The monarchy is more than people. It's a system, a machine. A psychological operating theater where every smile is calibrated, every silence speaks, every gesture is evaluated for future historical consequence. You don't just marry into this world. You collide with it. And collisions change the trajectory of the object that survives. Ask yourself this honestly. When you witnessed the royal controversies online, did you ever wonder how much of it felt like a screenplay rather than tradition? You're not alone. Millions felt that dissonance, that tension, that subconscious pull that whispered, there's another layer here. Something early, something personal, something unsaid. Great storytelling begins where clarity ends. That's what theories are made of. That's what one-hour YouTube epics feast on. Let me seed the emotional architecture. Meghan Markle, a former American actress turned Duchess of Sussex, entered the royal sphere with the gravitational field of celebrity already behind her. Cameras didn't follow her into the family. They belonged to her long before the vows were exchanged. For Windsor, a dynasty built on controlled image sovereignty, this wasn't just disruptive. It was existentially irritating. It was unpredictable input injected into a 1,000-year-old operating system. So imagine this. You're Prince William, the future king, raised in protocols older than electricity, now watching your sister-in-law recalibrate global headlines simply by breathing in public. No rulebook covers optics like that. No precedent document fully teaches envy when media power asymmetry shifts inside a blood hierarchy. You think royal drama is about hierarchy alone? No, it's about narrative leverage. Who holds it? Who wields it? Who accidentally redefines it by simply being modern? Have you ever been in a room where someone else controls the mood, even if you're technically senior? Multiply that by global press reach, dynasty psychology, and the burden of future kingship expectations. That's the emotional cocktail we're dissecting here today. Let's address the curiosity gap, the thing your audience will feel without it being fully said. The palace isn't a house. It's a stage. And every new character is unconsciously assessed for their long-term retention effect on the monarchy, the brand, the social sentiment, and the stability of perception capital. Meghan brought sentiment capital in abundance, but not the dialect Edwardian Britain was trained to interpret kindly. Some saw relatability. The system saw volatility. And volatility is only tolerated when it is inherited, not imported. Here's the twist you must tease without revealing. William didn't just announce something that morning. He announced something he had been psychologically edging toward long before any public meeting. But how? When did restraint convert into resolve? When did irritation solidify into mission? When did familial distance become a policy draft awaiting signature? These questions pull viewers deeper in seconds. Because by the time someone publicly utters, "we disown you," you're not watching a moment. You're watching a conclusion built on many invisible signals stacked like dominoes behind the velvet curtains. What signal do you think broke first? A canceled meeting? A designer's refusal? A clipped curtsy? Or a conversation overheard by a servant who never signs NDAs? Hold that thought. Let's establish relevance. Why this story matters now. Because the world has evolved into consuming power disputes like content as narrative battlefields. Monarchies and celebrities both traffic in perception, but celebrities do it daily and monarchies do it generationally. When those cycles clash, press coverage becomes the battlefield dust cloud that hides the actual duel. And audiences feel cheated. You felt cheated by the news cycle, didn't you? You heard pieces. You never got the completed arc. This outline exists to prevent that feeling in your one-hour masterpiece. The intro must justify the obsession. Is this scandal? Or sociology? Monarchy psychology? Media theory? Family betrayal tragedy? Honestly, it's the hybrid that magnets viewers into 60-minute retention jail before they realize they're trapped. Because now, viewers don't distinguish between gossip and power pattern analysis. They distinguish between boring and unmissable. And this story has never been boring. But was it incomplete? Absolutely. Which is exactly why a 1-hour, 30,000-word script is justified. We are here to assemble the pieces like a narrative forensic analyst holding a jeweled scalpel, cutting into the mythology without needing receipts to prove emotional truth. The emotional truth is always the real retention device. Let's frame William's role properly before chapters expand from this base. William is not impulsive. He's the personification of deliberate pacing. That means if he ever makes a tough announcement, you should assume the emotional iceberg was 90% submerged for months. That's the rhythm. That's the character. That's exactly why viewers will gasp when his emotional temperature spikes unexpectedly on camera later in your script arc. This is where to insert contradiction, because the public thinks of William as stable, gentle, poised, and duty-locked. Yet every stable persona has a shadow frequency. The frequency that only family members can trigger. The frequency that says, I will withstand anything publicly, but I reserve my toughest words for blood, not broadcast. Do you feel that duality? The audience will too, if you build properly. And since you cannot bold or summarize, the intro must emotionally demonstrate the stakes alone through architectural depth and pacing variances. Let's tease the 3 major payoffs that must echo through the entire 1-hour tale. The hidden letter. The legal device. The hot mic moment. In the intro, you must mention them like mythical artifacts without revealing origin, contents, or impact until later chapters demand emotional payoff. You do not reveal the artifact early. You reveal its inevitability. Think of it like Chekhov's time bomb instead of Chekhov's gun. The audience doesn't need to see the bomb detonated to feel tension. They need to see it placed covertly and winked at for 60 minutes. That's retention engineering. So here's how you elude without revealing. A document arrived. A rulebook was flipped open. And a mic that should have been off was quietly testing the weight of the future king's honesty. That one line alone can stitch 10 minutes of attention when read in a compelling intro pace. Let's now anchor emotional themes your audience expects to feel across a 1-hour arc drama. Betrayal, irony, familial fracture, public shock, personal duty conflict, image power collision. And the tone that makes viewers feel like insiders while never proving any real accusation. Because here, emotional realism does not require evidentiary verification. It only requires plausible psychology and global symbolism viewers already believe without needing convincing. Have you ever watched 2 power structures wrestle for narrative dominance? Of course you have. Celebrity versus institution is the defining genre of our era. Now at a crown, cameras, inheritance pressure, duty psychology, and a duchess trained in Hollywood pacing instead of aristocratic cadence. That's your narrative universe. And this intro must justify why this hybrid feud deserves 1 hour, not 5 minutes. Let's layer pacing and tensions for your script. Your 1-hour script will vary between short, punchy spikes and long, reflective storytelling. This intro must demonstrate that variation early so the audience unconsciously calibrates to expect constant pacing evolution. Deliver a short emotional punch, then a slow inhale of royal context. then another spike of contradiction, then a longer anecdote. That rhythm makes viewers unable to click away because the next second might contradict the last one. That's the destabilizing allure of expose retention pacing. Here's a mini example you'd mention in scripting later. Calm crowns. Loud tabloids. Quiet wars. Until the quiet stopped. That's pacing instruction embedded into text, not bolding. Let's now frame why this matters globally in intro form. Because the British royal family isn't just a monarchy. It's an inherited psychological contract with the world. Viewers care because they feel like they inherited the story too, even though they didn't. That possession feeling, that parasocial inheritance, is your intro justification. Give viewers a villain they're unsure of, contradiction they can't resolve, stakes they can't ignore, and narrative artifacts you tease without opening fully. And you do it for 2,000 words minimum. So by the time Chapter 1 begins, they're imprisoned by curiosity and emotional pacing. Before we transition, let's address one subtle nuance that becomes retention turbo fuel. William never makes announcements alone. He makes announcements with two audiences subconsciously in mind. The public, and the dinner table he reports to privately. So early tease. The phrase viewers heard was the royal phrasing. But the phrase the family heard was different. Same announcement, two frequencies, two psychological payloads. That's the internal message you circle back to only in Chapter 12 or 14, not in the intro. The intro simply says, the cameras heard protocol. The family heard consequence. And the unseen mic later would hear honesty at last. That builds viewer prophecy, not reveal. You can almost feel the tension now, can't you? Good. Because that means your viewers will feel it faster. Remember, for a 1-hour script, the introduction isn't a handshake. It's a narrative handcuff. It must justify obsession without summarizing anything. It explains relevance. It seeds payoff artifacts. It paints psychological duality. It spikes emotion through pacing variations. And it ends with a cliffhanger that opens narrative gates for the next chapter to flood through. So let's close the introduction outline narrative with a transition cliffhanger suggestion you will literally script at the end. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happened first wasn't a headline. It was a warning wrapped in a non-event. That's the unsettling truth about how palace fractures begin. Not with noise, but with disruption so subtle you misremember its danger. Imagine checking your phone at dawn. No buzz, no alerts, no crisis banners. And yet, somewhere else, the story has already begun writing itself without you. That's exactly where we enter now, at the first hairline fracture in a narrative that would later escalate into those unforgivable words. But in the beginning, it was nothing you could screenshot, because the first signal never raises its voice. It lowers it. Have you ever felt like you missed the first sign of a breakup until months after it happened? Hold on to that feeling, because that's the currency of this story, the moment before the moment, the thing before the confession, the micro-injury before the public amputation of a relationship. And to understand how William reached a point no heir should ever reach, we start with the thing no one logged, the first signal. The day Kensington stopped reacting and started evaluating. It began almost insultingly quietly. A Tuesday evening, late summer. The kind of evening where royal schedules run like Swiss watches, but the family pretends it's casual. Security officers change shifts. Aides file paperwork. The Thames keeps moving like an indifferent witness. William was photographed that day doing renter-approved optics, school drop-offs, handshakes, a smile trained to read as permanence. Stable William. That's what the headlines always whisper. The man engineered for duty, not drama. But even then, unseen, undocumented by any journalist, felt only by the people orbiting his life, something was off-tempo. One Kensington staffer would later explain it like this in private. He wasn't angry yet, but he was altered. And alteration is more threatening in the royal psyche than fury, because fury is emotional weather. Alteration is climate change. And the palace is always sniffing for climate change, especially leaked climate change. The first signal wasn't visual. It was procedural. William began approving fewer joint briefing notes that included Meghan's name. Not rejecting them. That would have been loud. Just letting them linger longer in a waiting sign-off, purgatory than protocol prefers. You know a royal machine loves pace, right? Slow approval wasn't bureaucratic friction. It was emotional hesitation disguised as admin timing. The monarchy is excellent at portraying distance as workload. But people inside Kensington knew better. And viewers like you, watching from outside, always sense when something's being iced, even if you can't prove freezer temperature. A document delayed is a statement avoided. A statement avoided is a limit softly tested. And William testing limits on briefing documents was psychologically louder than a shout. Then came the second micro-tell. Invitations. Or more notably, the evolution of invitations. Kensington Palace always codes relationships through proximity tokens. Who gets invited early? Who gets appended last? Whose name lives in the suggested attendees column instead of the essential family column. Early that autumn, Meghan's name transitioned from presumed present to considered optional. Optional is fine in ordinary families. In a dynastic one, optional is exile's embryo. And embryo stages are where retention lives. Because the audience watching royal stories doesn't just consume the argument. They consume the build to the argument. And this build was slow, frosted, deliberate. Victorian men used to duel with pistols at dawn. Modern heirs duel with seating arrangements at 4 p.m. But then came the moment that would later be remembered as the first real fracture, even though it still wasn't public. A scheduled informal coordination dinner between senior royals and key communications architects that was framed for later press harmonization. The agenda included non-threatening pillars, charity optics, autumn scheduling, regional PR cohesion strategies, and one item that should have been insignificant, but wasn't: Meghan Markle's media rhythm. Or, more precisely, the Sussex narrative divergence, disguised like a non-dramatic agenda label so that no journalist would understand it if it leaked. But leaks don't leak meaning. They leak existence. And existence leaks are sometimes more effective in engagement retention engineering than detail leaks, because detail leaks admit content. Existence leaks admit stakes and mystery. And stakes and mystery wire dopamine deeper than facts. Inside that dinner, the Sussex item sparked the earliest recorded contradiction in William's psyche: public politeness versus private evaluation escalation. William didn't lose his temper. He tightened it. A tightening is always more narratively terrifying in the Windsor system than a rupture, because a tight rope means someone might fall later. And someone falling, someone being evaluated as fall-prone, someone being narratively acknowledged as unstable, is more gripping than an accusation. It's prophecy. It is Chekhovian prophecy. And Chekhovian prophecy is retention's finest spice. Let me paint how the contrast worked psychologically. You would hear laughter in the opening 30 minutes. Anecdotes about autumn scones, ridiculous memories of Balmoral hikes, sibling teasing, Camilla's chaotic tea order misadventures. All banal, all carefully deployed social camouflage. But then it happened. As the Sussex divergence item was read aloud by an aide whose voice was trained for neutrality, but whose trembling finger betrayed a micro-emotion, William leaned forward, not dramatically, but physically symbolically. Symbolism lives in millimeters for royals. A forward lean is not body language alone. It is readiness. And readiness at a Sussex agenda item meant where the monarchy thought it might have to act later. And future crowns don't like future acting obligations imported from Hollywood. Then he asked the question that would later echo through your entire script arc. Are we correcting narrative, or being corrected by narrative? Short, punchy, dangerous. That question wasn't for the press. It was for the family tribunal that every heir unconsciously holds inside his head. And this is where viewers begin feeling the pull of allegiance conflict. Because if a royal heir even privately asks a question this existential about someone in the family, you know room temperature has changed. But you don't know how. Yet. And yet is where you keep them for hours. Here comes the dramatic irony for retention pacing. Meghan constantly read public distance as media exhaustion or duty overflow, never recognizing evaluation subtext. She interpreted a system's micro-freeze as calendar congestion. That's the contradiction. Someone trained in Hollywood optics reading a dynastic machine like it was a celebrity booking schedule. And that misread becomes retention humor fuel when juxtaposed with the palace's version. We weren't busy. We were bracing. Do you feel that contradiction? Because your viewers will pine to resolve it for an hour. What came next wasn't a confrontation. Not yet. It was subtraction. Subtraction is the royal language for we are thinking. Thinking is the royal language for we are preparing. Preparing is the royal language for something is about to fracture narratively inside the walls of 1,000 cameras trained to look like nothing. Have your viewers ever noticed that you can remove someone without announcing removal? That's exactly how the monarchy does it. And that technique mirrors content strategy, doesn't it? Tease removal early. Reveal meaning of removal later. But back to the timeline. Days passed. Nothing broke. Weeks passed. Morning briefings as ordinary as executors after death, greeting cards, public engagements, charitable optics. But now William's aides noticed something incredibly subtle. He was reading more, approving less. His signatures shortened in flourish. His margins widened in notes. A note entered into the margin is a chess move seeded. And viewers love seeds turning into redwoods. Especially redwoods no journalist has authority to trim. Every morning William would now ask an unspoken question at the start of his day about Sussex optics. Is this family or broadcast material? That question haunted corridors without needing to be said in print. Now, audience, let me insert your first retention device question in script form, the type you'd weave at 1-hour intervals later. Have you ever had a family disagreement that resurfaced only when cameras weren't rolling? Great. Now imagine 1,000 cameras, 100 aides, 10 heirs, and only one future crown holder with admin power and emotional restraint superior to any actor's training. Multiply your awkward dinner conversation by constitutional inheritance psychology. That's the stage. Then came a PR briefing moment that didn't make the news, but set up payoff for chapters 6 and 10. A major London publication requested comment from William's household on a speculative Sussex optics concern piece. Normally, Kensington issues press dampening responses immediately. This time, William's press secretary issued a perfect corporate neutrality paragraph. But William himself didn't weigh in. That absence of air voice was felt more than printed paragraphs. And viewers love absence when it feels like a lock needing a key. This is where the tension spikes. The absence is the answer, one aide would later murmur. But viewers didn't know the key yet. After that briefing, invitations were pruned further. Not officially, just algorithmically, emotionally algorithmically. Names moved on internal contact flows. Call logs changed in frequency. Notices weren't inflammatory yet. They were alchemical, turning closeness into distance subtly. You ever notice someone texting you less before blocking you entirely? That's personal psychology. The palace's version was the dynastic one. We aren't blocking. We are deciding. And the deciding phase is always more narratively engaging than the final verdict. Then came the analogy you will echo again in Chapter 15's payoff mood. Orchards don't kill trees in summer. They stop watering them quietly until autumn answers for them. William stopped watering narrative proximity jointly with Meghan long before any press confrontation. Still subtle? Absolutely. Still gripping? Infinitely. Because the story isn't what was said. It's when did the watering stop? And the watering stopped months before Chapter 10's hidden letter lands. Let us escalate tension pacing properly. Because the audience must feel progression, not admin translation. William's moral compass publicly is like a lighthouse. Privately, a compass recalibrating inches is more threatening than a lighthouse beam rotating loudly. Because quiet recalibration implies future decision opacity. And future opacity is always retention gold. And retention gold is what 1-hour scripts feast on. So now, the final emotional beat of Chapter 1. You thought this started loud. It started small. It didn't fracture publicly. It chilled privately. Chill is more narratively scary than fracture because fracture spills. Chill foreshadows silence wars later. And those silence wars blow open later by Chapter 14's hot mic moment. That mic that gets accidentally left on. That's the climax of chill payoff. The subtext you planted early and pay off late, like you asked. So let's close with your engineered cliffhanger transition line. But silence wasn't the message. It was the warning. She thought the frost was weather. It was plate tectonics. That's how Kensington fractures really move, slow until they lurch. Let me ask you this right up front, the kind of line you drop in the first 7 seconds of a chapter to snap a viewer back into the story. Have you ever misread someone's growing distance as exhaustion instead of intention? Because Meghan did. And the palace knew she did. William knew she did. That misread is the hinge of this entire arc. Because if Chapter 1 was the signal, Chapter 2 is the strain gauge ticking upward, decimal by decimal, until the heir's patience, reputation duty, and psychological thresholds start vibrating like a held breath before a shout. The public narrative always focuses on confrontation. But confrontation is dessert. We're still in the kitchen. The breaking point started with a joke. The kinds of jokes that don't feel like jokes if you remember royalty listens for threat patterns, not punchlines. It was a briefing room banter moment. Whiteboards faint with marker ghosts, schedules coded in initials, guards behind frosted glass, the air non-dramatic in presentation, suffocating in subtext. An aide had said, too lightly, too casually, too close to the thing an heir shouldn't joke about. The crown survived abdication. It will survive Netflix. Laughter sparked like a match head. Quick, sharp, brief. But William didn't laugh immediately. He let the room get its mirth out first. Because the heir does not react to the sentence. He reacts to its contagion potential. And in that delay, that deliberate delay, you already get an emotional spike. Because you can always tell when a future leader is hearing the tone behind your tone. I'll rewind it in script pacing later. William smiled. Measured. Then he asked, and what if the crown one day becomes content, not contract? Short line. Longer implication. That shift from laughing at divergence to laughing around divergence marked when calm shifted into calculation. And every calculation William makes is a breadcrumb trail with a time delay fuse. Because now Kensington's environment changed from shielding to scrutinizing. Shielding is easy to narrate. They're protecting her. But scrutinizing? They're measuring her. Measuring what? Intentions? Leverage? PR magnet pull? Family hierarchy disruption quantum potential? You don't answer that now. You let them stew on it. That's retention oven cooking. But I'm giving you the mood build so your next section has legs. So here's what viewers didn't know. Scrutiny had already been formalized in rhythm long before wording. Rhythm is what monarchy bureaucracies measure loyalty and threat through. Message cadence, cooperation reciprocity, push notification urgency patterns. A Sussex pivot wasn't announced like a vote or a bill or a jury. It was tracked like a heartbeat that didn't know it was wearing a blood pressure cuff. William had asked for the media interaction logs. Not dramatically, just dutifully. Stack every divergence point. I don't need the synthesis. I need the timeline. That means, when perception icebergs melt, William wants melt beginnings, not melt ends. Because melt ends are spill. Melt beginnings are intent geometry. And the monarchy is obsessed with intent geometry. Now, audience, think about how this will hit different demographics. To the average viewer, a PR briefing log sounds like admin, so what? They read files. But to the heir in the Windsor system, a log is an indictment prospectus, not an admin artifact. So you narrate the contradiction like this. Documents aren't evidence in this family. They're leverage potential energy. And leverage energy is only ever acknowledged when the dominoes stack tall enough to break air pressure. William escalated the scrutiny by adding social contradiction pressure. He publicly defended politeness. He privately evaluated leverage. He administratively empowered demotion by omission. That triple stack eye of the storm pacing is how you keep viewers guessing. Because which version is real? They're all real until one gets broadcast. Families contain multitudes. Dynasties contain memos. But heirs contain internal tribunals that never leak transcripts. And that's where Meghan misread the tectonic shift. She thought the internal tribunal was a writer's room. It was an audit panel. Then came a boundary that turned out not to be a boundary, but a test. Later Chapter 9 will reveal the mechanism behind these tests, but right now we just hint at its placement. A family photography schedule for a charity initiative, something banal enough to bore most outsiders if framed badly, but impossible to click away from if framed properly. Because William delivered this line, privately, during sign-off evaluation timing. Group shots should never feel like casting calls. That line wasn't dramatic in volume, but it was constitutional in its direction. Because in the Windsor's internal grammar, should never feel means currently feels means must be corrected, and must be corrected means may be subject to future gatekeeping policy. This is when the Sussex story stopped feeling like family drama and started feeling like brand hygiene. Hygiene can be surgical if the wound festers long enough. Now the emotional beat in the middle section. Meghan kept pushing for proximity positioning through media equivalence language, the democratic language of celebrity. Seen equals said. Booked equals valued. Covered equals canon. But William's language is the opposite. Said equals scheduled. Scheduled equals essential. Essential equals inherited. Inherited equals protected. Protected equals unspoken. When you translate those grammars into each other, someone always comes out illiterate. Then came a designer moment. Not about gowns or clothes yet, that's Chapter 10 era, but about influence signaling, where Kensington assessed that celebrity dynastic influence asymmetry had crossed internal optics hygiene threshold. A charity gala that wasn't Sussex talent aligned. Invitations recalibrated like a comp list, designers and stylists recategorized from courtesy list to essential list for brand hygiene imaging. Meghan requested wardrobe designer early privilege because she assumed early privilege is value signaling. That request hit Kensington like a discordant laugh track. But William's inner tribunal heard it differently. Privilege is never early. Privilege is earned. Earned privilege never needs requesting. That contradiction becomes the moment viewers feel their alliances start itching. Because by the time fluctuations happen, your viewers are bound by curiosity. They want to resolve who's earned, who's inherited, who misread, who requested altitude without reading oxygen levels. Then came the deep social micromeeting no journalist would ever track. Aids standing like punctuation, guards like margins, T like camouflage. William quietly noted designer recommendation edits, stylist internal roles, signage intelligence for later political and public payoffs in Chapter 5 and 15. It escalated further. He stopped asking if Meghan was family. He started asking when she stopped being interpreted as family. And now the audience is feeling the gear shift. Because when did interpretation break is much more gripping than did interpretation break. The late-night kitchen meeting of strategy wasn't about firing her or disowning her or demoting her or correcting anything publicly yet. It was about drafting the potential energy for drafting later. William commissioned a narrative climate audit timeline, spreadsheets of PR proximity, media divergence, and symbolic influence oscillation analysis. We don't conclude now, he stated. Later your script will literally say that. We timeline now. Conclusions choose themselves when the tower stacks high enough. That line alone is 5 minutes of retention bondage when delivered in a script style. Emotion spikes further, because then William personally signed off fewer items that included Meghan's name in shared briefings. Not rejecting them, just letting them expire unwatered longer, internal algorithmic omission drafting. You know an heir says more by omission than declaration, right? That rhetorical viewer question is one you drop later in your 1-hour epic to reacquire interest. But right now we're narrating build, not giving receipts. And the palace absolutely noticed that omission drafting is policy embryology. Because every time a name is omitted long enough in a monarchy, a future constitution quietly hiccups. And constitutional hiccups are more gripping than rows. Now let me weave the contradiction and psychology beats in prose form. Public William, always polite. Private William, always evaluating. Admin William, omission is governance. Meghan's interpretation, omission is calendar workload. Royal interpretation, omission is climate audit stage 1. That dissonance is retention gold. Because humans can't resolve cognitive dissonance without clicking away from your script. Then an internal interview moment. 1-8 asked William, "Are we briefing or bracing?" William responded, "Not briefing. Bracing. There will be no briefing until briefing is irrelevant." That response confirmed that William is no longer reacting to PR what's. He is calibrating leverage wins. Let's escalate further. He commissioned a psychological audit timeline. Not about guilt or innocence. About pressure or privilege. Influence or inheritance. Sympathy or strategy. Meaning or mechanism. And you might think an audit is boring. But it depends on tone. A 1-hour YouTube script audit is boring only if you summarize. We're not summarizing anything. We're dramatizing the act of audit as a prophetic threshold measurement. Then came Chapter 2's final mini cliffhanger beat. Because once Williams started timelining divergence, the palace started bracing for the document. Not the reaction, the mechanism that Chapter 9 and 10 will reveal. But reveal later, seed now. So you end the chapter with prophecy, not conclusion. But the first signal wasn't the fracture. It was the annotation. And that annotation was already in William's margins, and the next chapter would flip the tone entirely. But that tone flip wasn't the announcement. The announcement was the symptom. The real fracture was in the grammatical DNA of the monarchy, and you deliver the final line. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. That was the prophecy at the end of chapter 2. And as promised, we're flipping the board now. Because this wasn't just a summit. It was a narrative ambush disguised in monarchical etiquette. You think leaks are loud? No. Leaks are scalpel silent and headline violent. But we're not at headline yet. We're at the summit that would later breed the headline. The kind of meeting where the chairs themselves feel like characters, the tea tastes like diplomatic anesthesia, and the aides stand like unblinking colons separating eras. Have you ever attended a meeting that could have been an email, but history forced it to be a courtroom later? That's the geometry we're entering. The summit was scheduled for reconciliation optics. It delivered rupture physics instead. It was late September at Kensington Palace. Not the big palace, the other palace, the domestic one made of routines and resentments that never get wedding photos. The senior royals had agreed to gather for what press releases would later frame as a narrative alignment briefing, an engineered détente to compress media divergence entropy. But its timing? Suspiciously precise. 5:42 p.m., just after school runs, just before evening reporters file drafts. The monarchy doesn't believe in coincidences, and your viewers don't either, do they? Great. Because disbelief is the glue that keeps them from walking away. William walked in last. Not first. Last. He wasn't avoiding attention. He was measuring its readiness. The summit began with small talk. Of course it did. Royals always enter emotionally in lowercase before converting to uppercase behavior. Autumn feels long this year, someone murmured. Scotland's fog has my respect again, someone joked. But those lines? Camouflage. The real conversation was already wired inside unspoken parentheses around everyone's ribs. And then came the first leak. Not the content, just the knowledge it happened. That's how monarchy leaks work best. Existence before evidence. A journalist later confessed in an interview that their best sources aren't always people. Sometimes they're patterns. A deputized source inside Kensington had noticed that this summit had been scheduled twice, canceled once, and moved 3 times before landing at an almost offensively banal Wednesday evening. Cancellations are emotional Morse code in royal families, aren't they? 1 cancellation equals scheduling friction. 2 equals concern. 3 equals excommunication embryology. This summit had hit its 3rd coordinate before the first canopy was served. And yet the press never sees embryology. They see babies and baptisms after birth. Viewers can smell afterbirth. They can't smell embryo. That's why embryo narration retains longer. So let's dive inside. The sealed doors were literal. The stakes were symbolic. But the implication was constitutional even if never spoken that way. William's goal wasn't to accuse. It was to quantify distance. Quantifying distance involves spreadsheets, minutes, optics risk analysis, influence anomaly tracking, and a psychological climate audit. When a name stops being used in conversation, is the person still essential? Or just present by archival inertia? That is the kind of question you drop to the audience mid-chapter to restart curiosity after every pacing valley. Now, the contradiction lay here. Information that should leak rarely does. Information that shouldn't leak always hunts microphones with heat-seeking intent. This summit was accidental only in leaking, not in its happening. It was a Sussex narrative-dampening coordination meeting, with the first 20 minutes delivered like a ceremonial bomb over a wound that never admitted blood. But after 20 minutes, William deliberately inserted a pacing shift. Because heirs don't disrupt meetings immediately. They modulate them until modulation becomes authority. Modulation is monarchy anesthesia. Authority is monarchy prescription. That's the line a constitutional scholar would later laugh at, bitterly, 3 chapters from now. Then, the build-up. William asked for a sequential audit overview. Not accusation. Not guilt. Not innocence. Just timeline strain. Before we speak tone, we must speak trajectory, one aide would later recall him saying. And trajectory statements are where gossip graduates into system psychology in Succession monarchy narratives. Let me map the timeline they reviewed. The audience will love the retrospective structuring. The silence phase, Chapter 1. The strain phase, Chapter 2. The summit, Chapter 3. The leak kernel. Now, this summit leak kernel. A Kensington aide had accidentally left a voice recorder on while fetching Earl Grey. That recorder would later serve as the symbolic artifact of timeline breakage. It still didn't contain evidence, just existence. You want the audience's jaw to lower at just the knowing that this summit happened rather than what was said yet. Then came the ironic layering that's YouTube perfect for retention pacing. A monarchy financed by lineage does not feud by volume. It feuds by circulation of inevitability. Have you ever noticed that inevitability is more gripping than anger because anger shouts once, inevitability writes for decades? Exactly. That's your center pacing. Now let's explore key dialogue beats without making any real accusations. Fictional dramatization only, no defamation. William's first question, are we aligning or auditing? Family response, polite nods. Inner tribunal implication, audit. Meghan's orbit didn't collapse that minute. That minute was inoculation dosage. Because William's language wasn't emotional. It was structural. Structural words hit longer than emotional ones in monarchy DNA. They open gates slowly, then close them permanently. But permanence payoffs belong to Chapter 9 and 14, and we're not opening those gates yet. Then the scholars section of scrutiny that your audience will later feast on, told like paradox narration instead of boring admin recitals. Acceptable divergence versus inherited divergence tolerance thresholds. Influence anomaly versus lineage duty friction. Perception capital versus constitutional inheritance. And here is the crucial retention fuel contradiction delivered mid-chapter. William tolerated PR divergence publicly. He audited narrative influence privately. Meghan interpreted this as scheduling congestion. The palace interpreted this as succession climate audit stage 3. Who was right? They were both right about the misread. But only one was right about the intention. And intention is the audience's prison cell key. They want it. You don't give it until payoff chapters. Now, how did this matter to global sentiment and viewer psychology? The royal family doesn't trade in villains. It trades in archetypes. Archetypes don't need defamation. They need mythic plausibility. As long as you cast your narrative as a dramatized exposé tale, you avoid making real defamatory claims. The drama is in patterns, implicit conflict, institutional psychology, not literal crimes. Then we talk emotional spike beats that rope audiences deeper. Kate's team increasing emotional frost toward Meghan. Harry physically absent but emotionally present later. Charles calmly bracing for climate audit device. Chapter 9 payoff. Tabloids delirious on optics dessert. Have you ever sensed that joint public relations breakage often resolves only when subconscious alliances collapse behind the scenes? Probably yes. And your audience will too. Just remind them at pacing valleys. And now here comes the exit clause. The moment one aide would later recall William's physical energy shift like a dagger disguised in politeness. He leaned forward. Because he already knew the artifact had leaked. But the artifact wasn't evidence. It was prophecy. And prophecy is more addictive than conclusion. William said something that would later breed the headline, but we're not giving it here. Just teasing its future existence as prophecy without characters quoting direct defamatory insults. And here comes the emotional humor irony payoff seed. Silence is monarchy warning. Alignments are monarchy framing. Summits are monarchy pressure tests. But microphones one day reveal the grammar. And you end like this, leaving your audience in the exact handcuff loop you asked for. But the summit wasn't the announcement. It was the calibration. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. But the summit wasn't the reveal. It was merely the knock. And now, with a narrative precision that only an heir raised in generations of silent calculation could deliver, we enter the hour when the palace halls felt like instruments waiting for a score. This wasn't the public disowning. This was the emotional tremor inside the family itself. And if you ever grew up in a space where love is inherited but approval is conditional, you already know which one hits harder when it's threatened. This is the chapter where the Sussex story stopped being a branch topic and became the trunk of an unspoken ultimatum forest. Let me ask you this before we go deeper. Have you ever seen a feud become a mirror? A moment where everyone stops asking, "What did they do?" and starts asking, "What does this say about us?" That's exactly what happened when Meghan's narrative presence began to register less as a person in the royal ecosystem and more like a system anomaly that someone still had to interpret, react to, process, or exile silently. Exile is always louder in systems than anger because anger dissipates. Exile endures, and endurance is where one-hour scripts build their cathedral bones. Inside Kensington that week, Kensington wasn't bracing for cameras. Kensington was bracing for family consensus frequency alignment. When William requested the sequential audit in Chapter 3, he unknowingly opened a procedural gravity well, because now every senior royal unconsciously felt like their own relevance was being measured against the unpredictable input of modern celebrity phrasing Meghan had injected. Meghan didn't just change headlines. She changed how the royals felt their own seats were weighted in perception and psychological capital. One family member's divergence becomes everyone's anxiety, especially in dynasties built on unwavering image permanence. The narrative that she didn't understand the frost now evolved into something administratively acknowledged by everyone orbiting William's tribunal psyche that week. But here is the contradiction that will make the packaging feel irresistible to your viewers when they later revisit this in your script. The public saw drama as personality conflict. The palace saw drama as parameter drift. Meghan saw drift as media theatrics. William saw drift as system audit triggers. Do you feel that tension trying to resolve itself in your head? That's exactly the feeling your audience will burn cycles on if you pace properly. But pacing is what we're dramatizing, not proving. Because that week, designers, invitations, canapes, press briefings, internal dossier cadence analysis, all began to behave like compass needles tugged by iron filings named Sussex. Sussex wasn't the present threat. Sussex was the future pivot test case. And future pivots always ring louder in William's mind than present annoyances because an heir only gets to inherit impenetrability if he publicly audits vulnerability behind the scenes first. One key emotional fracture moment came not from William directly, but from the gravitational echo of his restraint. William's restraint acted like a silent judge holding an invisible gavel before he ever struck it. Family members weren't being told to disown Meghan yet. They were being caught in the tension between constituency optics cleanliness, loyalty grammar, and lineage cohesion frequency bracing. This is where internal alliances start forming without headlines announcing them. Subtext writes faster than press articles. Kate was already tightening her own emotional cadence when Meghan was mentioned in group coordination channels, long before William ever reached Chapter 12's disowning phrase. Charles and Camilla, publicly stoic, privately observant, constitutionally bound to react gently until reacting is enemy-free propaganda of distance calibration, felt their own optics climate spiking privately that week. But then something vital happened that viewers will connect back to later in your one-hour payoff. The family began rehearsing a distance they thought was temporary, until rehearsals became tradition. Have you ever rehearsed your boundaries with someone until it became the way you spoke to them permanently? That is exactly how monarchy PR systems rewrite social DNA without legislative or official phrasing needing to occur yet. Internal sheets now flowed like this. PR distance metrics. Influence anomaly mapping. Lineage grammar collision logs. Proximity demotion by omission patterns. Staff corridor observation whispers. Payoff belongs to Chapter 14 hot mic. Designers privately weighing influence asymmetry logbook state edits. Payoff to be delivered in Chapters 10 to 15. Invitations transitioning from inherited consensus to conditional review. And now William's inner tribunal moved from annotation mode to strain mode before conclusion mode arrives. Then, the family psychology dungeon experiment. William didn't ask family members to disown Meghan immediately. He asked them to remember when they first felt distance instead of closeness. Because remember when is the royal grammar for defining fracture timeline inception, not the fracture itself. That means the summit wasn't even the first signal. The summit was, I don't fully conclude test case, but we keynote now so conclusion chapters echo louder when they land. That's retention structuring. Everyone inside that meeting was nodding politely, but William heard it like a calibration consensus. Protocol alignment is fine. Parameter contamination isn't. Contamination is fine publicly only if we can inertially manage it privately first. Meghan's narrative gravity wave would later breed the headline that triggered Amazon MGM set drama in your other arcs. But we're not seeding that reveal now. We're seeding its inevitability shadow. Now let's visit the emotional spike ironies that lace this chapter to keep pacing brutal and addictive. A family invests in PR impenetrability like a treasury invests in gold, generationally. Celebrities invest in influence like content creators invest in monthly output, obsessively. Royals believe silence is power. Celebrities believe coverage is power. Coverage is louder. Silence is longer. An heir raised in permanence, temperament control hears divergence as threat patterns long before fury expresses itself. You can't disown someone without timeline consensus on when interpretation inversion began first. Now that final nuance is where chapter conclusion crescendo begins. Because while the press thought the story was pivoting on personality, the family thought the story was pivoting on succession optics cleanliness fiction, which is always dramatized, not litigated, in fictional universe telling terms. But your audience will think it was litigated because we just dramatized inevitability climate. And that climate was reaching for paper, policy, and a microphone that should have been off once. Now we end the chapter exactly the way you instructed, with a retention transition cliffhanger. But the disowning wasn't spoken yet. It was rehearsed in omission, until omission became inheritance in gesture. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They always say perception is the crown, but that week the crown had competition. The cameras were sharpening. The headlines were seasoning their knives. The world assumed the palace was on the defensive. The palace was not defending. The palace was selecting. And selection is always quieter than defense, but far more irreversible when an heir is the one holding the guest list. So here we are at the point most outsiders misinterpret as PR pressure. No, this was identity arithmetic. Royals don't fear stories. They fear equations that can't be balanced by ceremony. And the equation sitting in William's unspoken tribunal notebook looked like this. Sussex optics plus celebrity cadence times lineage permanence divided by public empathy asymmetry. Result? Indeterminate. And indeterminate results terrify dynasties because dynasties can narrate villains, but they can't narrate indeterminacy. Not without turning obsession into exile. Have you ever watched a feud where one side negotiates publicly by smiles, while the other side negotiates privately by spreadsheets of attention risk? You are watching one now. PR briefings between Kensington and London media partners had begun to look full on paper. They contained everything palatable. Philanthropy scheduling, British public empathy tokens, banal seasonal pleasantries, narrative alignment loops. Editors love loops, don't they? They retain attention. But loops are only powerful if someone doesn't notice their loops. William noticed. He always does. Because heirs read loops as vulnerabilities wearing disguises, not rhythm wearing loyalty. In one 40-minute war room sync, a Kensington communications architect displayed a trend graph mapping public sentiment polarization around Meghan Markle's coverage cycle. The graph itself was neutral. William's inner hearing? Not neutral. He asked, "Are we calming a story or cushioning a verdict?" The room exhaled. Because verdicts aren't loud until they're spoken. They echo first. Now, a trend review is ordinary corporate admin outside a monarchy. Inside the Windsors, a trend review is emotional seismology. It's predictive genealogy. Because genealogy is the physics of who you can eject, while PR seismology is the maths of who you may have to. Meghan was publicly adored by many viewers precisely for her unpredictability, emotional catharsis, democracy of celebrity behavior, unfiltered cadence, relatability spikes, emoji-friendly discourse. The palace interprets emoji-friendly discourse like powdered sugar. Pleasant, contaminating, but never serious enough to amputate publicly. The contradiction? Royals never admit contamination. They admit recalibration needs. Meghan assumed recalibration meant brand amplification synergy. The palace meant dampening inertia tests. Do you feel the cognitive dissonance pulling? Because your audience will need 50 minutes to resolve it in their head and beg for Chapter 9 to explain the mechanism. Then came the two-audience speaking problem. Most PR briefings are written for one audience: the public. Royal PR is always written for two: pubs and dinner tables. Public phrasing is gloves. Family phrasing is fingerprints. Fingerprints can't lie. Gloves can. A Kensington press member drafted a response for a London weekly piece speculating on royal proximity temperature. The wording? Courtesy alignment continues between the households. Perfectly empty. Perfectly royal. But the emptiness was the message. Some viewers think a royal PR response is the statement. No. The volume is the statement. The substance is marketing. William's aides delivered volume. Meghan delivered marketing misread. Let's escalate that contradiction in retention voice. Volume is family pressure. Substance is public anesthesia. And anesthesia is only administered when a wound has already been acknowledged without blood being mentioned publicly yet. Then the palace hallway moment. Hallways inside monarchies are like green rooms for Broadway. Everything rehearses before performance. But instead of performance prep, this was exile prep. Exile prep stage 1, silence analysis. Stage 2, strain logging. Stage 3, summit alignment memos. Stage 4, consensus by omission rehearsals. Stage 5, influence anomaly severity forecasting. This is where the PR machine expanded beyond lighting fuses and started placing tripwires. The family needed to know if public affection leverage could one day outweigh lineage inheritance capital. And if that affection belonged exclusively to Sussex input, Kensington would have to choose if they were managing influence or being managed by influence. That question is inherently 100-minute retention fuel. But 100-minute payoffs belong to chapters 13 to 15. We are only stewing seeds now like tea leaves under a teapot heavier than its ingredients justify. Now the emotional hit, the thing your audience will chew on halfway through a 1-hour script with impatience. Harry thought the palace was misjudging Meghan. Meghan thought Harry was translating Hollywood into Windsor. William thought Hollywood grammar was the misjudgment. The palace thought misjudgment was a recurrence risk, not a conclusion. Now, audience, ask yourself, when did you first notice royal PR stop sounding like support and start sounding like distance? That's called tonal inflection. And tonal inflection is more addictive than fact reveal, because tonal inflection implies structure. And structures collapse slower than facts, but echo longer than scandals. Then came the family PR psychology confrontation that was disguised in admin columns. Column 1, public empathy. Column 2, institutional hygiene. Column 3, lineage duty. Column 4, anomaly recurrence severity grade. Column 5, proximity risk of unearned privilege patterns. That meeting turned into a furious arithmetic contradiction where the question was no longer, do they like her? But can we afford to misread her cadence again later? The palace can afford anything financially. It can't afford analytical embarrassment. Analytical embarrassment is worse than fury because fury dissipates and embarrassment rings for generations in retention. Media patterns indicated the world thought Meghan was a protagonist. Kensington thought protagonists must never outshine the institution's narrative permanence. But protagonists always do if they don't know they're protagonists. Then came the moment that palace insiders would later code as a symbolic, non-defamatory character beat. He wasn't altering the public mood. He was altering the permissions that define family relevance quietly. William didn't revoke closeness. He scrutinized it until closeness had expiration anxiety. And expiration anxiety is more gripping than immediate hostility. Now, the audience insertion questions that must fill the valleys of your eventual 1-hour script will sound like this. Have you ever been evaluated without being fired until months later? Do you know someone who reads Hollywood contracts into royal protocols and misses the audit memo climate shift? What does silence say in families built on ceremony? You see, the insult wasn't, we disown you, at chapter 1 or 2. The insult was misinterpreting frost for weather, scrutinizing distance for congestion, and assuming monarchy pivots are casting calls instead of endurance calculations. Later chapters will pay off that psychological contradiction like a gavel drop heard around the world, but right now you only seed its inevitability, not its accusation. Then came the subtle defector nod that will pay off in chapter 8 without defamation. Designers and stylists whose influence harmonic recommendations had begun rejecting appearing alongside casting call vibe imagery for Meghan. Not irate rejection, but brand hygiene distancing, signaling an internal climate where lines were being quietly retimed. And now, the final emotional structural beat before the cliffhanger, the thing that glues London media battlefields into your narrative cathedral for 1 hour. The public sees narrative. The royals see trajectory. Meghan saw coverage. William saw calibration. Only one read permanence properly. And here comes that cliffhanger transition, exactly the style and structure you requested. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming.